الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا ومولانا محمد صلى الله عليه وسلم وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. رب اشرح لي صدري ويسر لي أمري واحلل عقدة من لساني يفقه قولي. قال الله عز وجل بعد أن أقول أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الذين يؤمنون بالغيب ويقيمون الصلاة ومما رزقناهم ينفقون. صدق الله مولانا العظيم. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. Ahlan wa sahlan wa marhaban bikum. I welcome you back to our course on Safinat al-Naja, or the ship of salvation. That is Imam al-Hadrami's text, which is an introduction to Shafi'i jurisprudence, or how to practice the deen according to Shafi'i law. And we have covered the kitab from the perspective of Tahara, so the first chapter basically, and the various components therein. And now we are looking at the chapter on Salah, Kitabus Salah. We have commenced this chapter already, and in this lesson we will look at the following discussions bi'idhnillah ta'ala: the 16 conditions of the opening takbir, the 10 conditions of Surah Al-Fatiha, the 14 shaddas of Surah Al-Fatiha, the 4 places to raise the hands, and the 7 conditions of prostration. And with that we commence our text بإذن تعالى. قال المصنف رحمه الله تعالى ونفعنا الله بعلومه وعلومكم آمين. فصل في شروط تكبيرة الإحرام. This section deals with the conditions of the opening takbir, in other words, the opening statement of Allahu Akbar. And as we stated, there are 16 conditions of the Takbiratul Ihram. It is important to note that when we commence the Salah officially commences at the time of saying Allahu Akbar. So this forms one of the integrals of the prayer, this opening statement of Allahu Akbar. The subsequent statements of Allahu Akbar, they are not integrals of the prayer according to the Shafi'i school. So if they were to be omitted or forgotten or not pronounced correctly, they would not affect the validity of the prayer. But the first takbir, the opening takbir, this one is critically important. Being an integral, it means that if you do not pronounce this correctly, or it is not present when you recite the opening takbir, if you do not recite it as it is meant to be recited here according to these 16 conditions, then there is a great possibility that your salah would be invalid. If you don't meet these requirements, the salah would basically be invalid, and one would need to restart that prayer. So the first, the author says, شروط تكبيرة الإحرام 16. The conditions of the opening Allahu Akbar are 16. أن تقع حالة القيام في الفرض. The first is that it is pronounced while standing in the fard prayer. This of course means that if it is a sunnah prayer, a supererogatory or voluntary prayer, then it does not need to be pronounced while standing. It can be pronounced while seated or in another position, because sunnah prayers, you can pray while seated or in a different state, whereas fard prayers, you need to do that in its full format, as long as one is physically capable of doing so and one has no preventative that is causing you to change the position. But under normal circumstances, under usual circumstances, it must be recited while standing, and Allah knows best. The second, وَأَن تَكُونَ بِالْعَرَبِيَّةِ. The second is that it must be in the Arabic language. Islam is very emphatic on preservation, and this stems forth from the preservation of the Quran. We know that the Quran is only in the Arabic language. The Quran is not considered in any other language but as a translation or an explanation of the meanings of the Quran. And for this reason, it is not valid to pray your salah except in the Arabic language. And of course, when we say that, we mean specifically the integrals of the prayer. So even somebody who embraces Islam right now, they would be required to learn the very basics of the prayer in order for the prayer to be fulfilled and valid according to sacred law. And while this may seem somewhat of a barrier for people who are not Muslim to enter into the fold of Islam, The focus is more on the preservation and the pristine nature or the authentic nature of this deen than to make things easier for others. So there's a balance between the two in that it's not difficult to learn the basic requirements of the prayer. Saying Allahu Akbar uh, is it's not very complicated. You can learn that very easily. And there are only a few recitations for the prayer in order for it to be considered valid. It is the opening takbir, it is the Fatiha, it is the tashahud and what is recited in the tashahud at the end, and the Assalamu alaikum rahmatullah. All the other aspects of the prayer and its recitation can be learned later. But it is important to notice that in Islam, the emphasis is always on preserving the sacred nature and the authentic nature of the text. So the Quran will only be considered in the Arabic language. The prayer will only be valid in the Arabic language, and Allah knows best. وأن تكون بلفظ الجلالة. It must be with لفظ الجلالة. This is the Arabic expression to indicate the name of Allah. So when we speak about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, in order to maintain decorum of His divinity, Rabbul Izzati wal Jalal, we don't say, for example, وأن تكون بالله. You don't say it must be with Allah. You say it must be with لفظ الجلالة, with a majestic name or the majestic word, which is the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So this is just a way of referring to the name of Allah while still maintaining a certain level of decorum and respect. So it must be with the word Allah. Lafdhul Jalala, it must be with the word Allah. So in future, if we refer to Lafdhul Jalala, you'd know that we are referring to the name of Allah. And the reason why we are not just saying the name of Allah is for the sake of smooth flow of the explanation and to preserve decorum and respect. Then number 4, وَبِلَفْظِ أَكْبَرِ. It must be with the word Akbar. So it must consist of both the name of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the word Akbar after. Then number 5, وَالتَّرْتِيبُ بَيْنَ اللَّفْظَيْنِ. There must be sequence between these two words. Allahu Akbar. It must be followed one after the other. These points may seem obvious, but for somebody just starting out and not realizing that there's no real flexibility in this, it must be in a certain way, this makes it quite clear that there's no flexibility in the way we recite it. We cannot change the way we recite it because there are certain requirements of sacred law that means it must be recited in that way. So it's sometimes it seems like, especially at this level, that one is stating the obvious. But remember, this is foundation level. This is the basic level. It is an introductory work. So somebody is just getting to understand what are the most important elements in order to preserve the validity of their prayer. And then, وَأَلَّا يَمُدَّ هَمْزَةَ الْجَلَالَةِ. One should not lengthen the hamza. The hamza is the at the beginning of lafdul jalala, the beginning of the name Allah. One should not lengthen that. In other words, one should not say Allahu Akbar, right? This is what is being referred to here. وَعَدَمُ مَدِّ بَاء. Then number 7, not to lengthen the letter of ba, so as to not say Allahu Akbar, right? Then number 8, وَأَلَّا يُشَدِّدَ الْبَاء. I'm not quite sure how one would manage this, but one should not place a shadda on the ba. So akabbar, I'm not sure, but there shouldn't be a repetition of the word of the letter ba, because a shadda is basically you double up the letter. So it should be a single pronouncement of the letter ba, akbar, as opposed to a double pronunciation. Again, I'm not sure how you would manage to do that, but you shouldn't do that, so that's a good thing. Then وَأَلَّا يَزِيدَ وَاوًا سَاكِنَةً أَوْ مُتَحَرِّكَةً بَيْنَ الْكَلِمَتَيْنِ. One should not add a waw sakina, right? A waw with a sukun, أو متحركة بين الكلمتين, or a waw to move between the two words. So in other words, one should not say Allahu wa Akbar or Allahu Akbar, right? Or Allahu Akbar, right? So the first Allahu Akbar, that would be adding the waw with the sukun. And the second, Allahu Akbar, it would be using the waw to move between the two words. So that should not be done either. Number 10, وَأَلَّا يَزِيدَ وَاوًا قَبْلَ الْجَلَالَةِ, not to add a waw before the name of Allah, lafdhul jalala. So not Allah, Wallahu Akbar, in other words. وَأَلَّا يَزِيدَ وَاوًا قَبْلَ الْجَلَالَةِ, not to add a waw before the words Allahu Akbar, just don't say Wallahu Akbar. وَأَلَّا يَقِفَ بَيْنَ كَلِمَتَيِ التَّكْبِيرِ وَقْفَةً طَوِيلَةً وَلَا قَصِيرَةً. Number 11, not to pause for a long or short while between these two words. So not to say Allahu Akbar or Allahu Akbar. So there must be no pause between the two words, and Allah knows best. Number 12, وَأَن يُسْمِعَ نَفْسَهُ جَمِيعَ حُرُوفِهَا. It is to cause oneself to hear all of its letters. What this basically means is that under normal circumstances, meaning you are within a condition where you have sound hearing meaning there's no defect with your ability to hear, and acoustically you are under usual circumstances. So you're not in some strange acoustic environment where either the noise level around you is extremely high, or for some reason, the acoustics is such that you cannot hear yourself. Those are unusual circumstances. But under usual circumstances, you can hear yourself. At the very least, your recitation, and this applies basically to all forms of recitation in sacred law, that it is going to be considered recitation when, for the very least, you are able to hear yourself under normal circumstances. So under normal circumstances, if you whisper, that would be sufficient to hear yourself. Now, of course, you can get different volumes of whispering, but the whispering that is required in order to make your prayer and your recitation considered valid and to be considered recitation is that for the very minimum, you need to be able to hear yourself. In order to sort of strike the balance on the other extreme so as to not disturb others, try to recite at a volume where you can hear yourself, but the person next to you can barely hear you. So then they can hear that you are reciting, or they can hear that there's some sound there, but they should barely be able to make out what you are saying. And if you cannot strike this, this balance, then try to ask the feedback of others in your close circles if they can assist you. But some people who are hard of hearing should be more careful so as to not recite too loud, and some people who are of the habit of reciting internally, the way we may read a novel in the English or other language, for example, is not the same way that we would recite when we are busy and engaged in an act of ritual worship like prayer or the recitation of Quran, especially when the act of worship that we are engaged in is a requirement or a fard, an obligatory element of Islam. There we need to be very careful so as to make sure we are meeting the minimum requirements, and Allah knows best. Then number 13, وَدُخُولُ الْوَقْتِ فِي الْمُؤَقَّةِ. It is an integral that your recitation of the Allahu Akbar, and to express this in a different way, that your commencement of the prayer must be after the time of the prayer had entered. And of course, this is specifically in relation to a prayer that has a fixed time. So obviously the 5 daily prescribed prayers and whatever other prayer has a fixed prescribed time. So you must know that the waqt had entered before you start praying the salah. Your salah would be invalid if you start praying and you're not quite sure whether the waqt had entered or not. If you have any doubts, what's best to do is to pause, figure out whether the waqt had entered or not, and then proceed to pray, as opposed to praying with a level of doubt, because then your prayer would be invalid, and Allah knows best. Number 14, وَإِيقَاعُهَا حَالَ الْإِسْتِقْبَالِ. That إِيقَاعُهَا, it needs to fall in, your Takbiratul Ihram should fall into حَالَ الْإِسْتِقْبَالِ, while you are facing the direction of the Qibla. Now, of course, based on our previous lesson, you would remember that facing the direction of the Qibla is one of the conditions of the prayer. So, naturally, if that is one of the conditions of the prayer, then you have to be facing the direction of the Qibla to make your prayer valid in the first place. And of course, this is the commencement of the prayer. So, this is exactly where you need to be in that position, and Allah knows best. Number 15, وَأَلَّا يُخِلَّ بِحَرْفٍ مِنْ حُرُوفِهَا. Not to change a single letter of its letters. Not to change the letter, meaning not to exchange one letter for another letter, substitute letters on purpose, right? If it is a speech impediment and the like, of course, لا يكلف الله نفسا إلا وسعها, but a deliberate substitution of one letter for another would be considered invalid, and Allah knows best. And then finally, number 16, وتأخير تكبيرة المأموم عن تكبيرة الإمام. To delay the takbir of the ma'moom, which is a technical term for follower, till after the takbir of the imam. Now, this one is very important because if the follower commences with the prayer before the imam commences with the prayer, then that follower's prayer isn't valid. So it's extremely important that the follower makes takes extra precaution as to make sure that his or her Allahu Akbar follows that of the imam and is not, it does not precede the imam's takbiratul ihram, nor is it coincidental. So obviously, this means that you wait until the imam says Allahu Akbar until you commence with your Allahu Akbar. That would be the safest, and Allah knows best. So those are the 16 shurut, the 16 conditions of the takbiratul ihram, the opening takbir of the prayer. Again, the word or the phrase takbiratul ihram, remember, it means the takbir, the pronunciation of Allahu Akbar, from kabbara, yukabbiru takbiran. So to proclaim the greatness of Allah, saying Allah is the greatest. And then al-ihram, of the state of sanctity. So you are saying Allahu Akbar, and that statement enters you into the condition of prayer. And we've explained this before, but as a reminder, the condition of prayer is sacred in that certain things that are usually permissible become impermissible when you enter into that state. The same applies when you enter into the state of ihram for Hajj or Umrah, for pilgrimage. But for the prayer, there are a different set of things. So for example, it's usually permissible to eat, it's usually permissible to speak, it's usually permissible to move. But when you enter the state of prayer, of salah, then it is no longer permissible to eat or drink or move, etc. So this is the importance of the takbiratul ihram. It essentially initiates your prayer and commences your prayer, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Now we move on to the next topic of discussion, which is the conditions of Surah Al-Fatiha. في شروط الفاتحة, the conditions of the Fatiha. شروط الفاتحة عشرة, the 10 conditions of the Fatiha. They are: number 1, الترتيب, the sequence. In other words, to recite the first verse first and the second verse second, etc. Number 2, والموالاة, continuity. In other words, that the Fatiha is not considered to be interrupted if one replies to the Ameen of the Imam. That's a side note, reminding him of the right ayah or verse when he errs, prostrates with the Imam in sajda to tilawa, forgetfully falls silent or absent-mindedly adds some dhikr in it. That's not an interruption. An interruption is when for no valid reason you stop your recitation of the Fatiha and then you continue later on. There needs to be continuity in the Fatiha, as opposed to the wudu. For the wudu, we said that continuity is a sunnah, right? Continuity in the Shafi'i school is considered a sunnah. But here, for the Fatiha, it is considered necessary, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. Then we move on, وَمُرَاعَاتُ حُرُوفِهَا, to observe the correct pronunciation of its letters. It is very important because the Fatiha is the most important recitation of the prayer of the Salah, and arguably the most important element of the Salah. And of course, this is the area in the prayer, this is the position in the prayer in which the Quran, the Kalam of Allah, is recited. And of all the recitation of a Muslim, the recitation of the Fatiha is probably the most important for him or her, because the validity of the prayer depends upon it. So I would highly advise any beginner student, any beginner Muslim, new Muslim, to try as best as possible to master the Fatiha before moving on to any other form of memorization or recitation or pronunciation or tajweed, etc. And the simplest way of doing this, before getting into the theory, one may imagine that if you want to recite correctly, that you need to learn the rules of recitation. Now that's important, that's a science on its own, tajweed. But the easiest and most practical way to learn this is shafawiyan. In other words, to listen to a teacher, a reliable teacher who knows the rules, who applies the rules, and is able to rectify your mistakes. So listen to his or her recitation and then follow along with the recitation in a one-on-one sitting, and then allow them to coach you in your recitation of the Fatiha. This is going to be the most straightforward method of mastering the Fatiha, so that you can ensure the validity of your prayer. Thereafter, of course, it would be great to learn the basics of tajweed, and then the more advanced rules of tajweed, and the makharij of the letters, how to pronounce the letters, where exactly from the mouth or the throat or the tongue or the lips the letter and its sound emanates. These are all considered part of the knowledge and the sciences of recitation of the Quran, and they are beautiful and they are fantastic, but they are not necessary to get the bare minimum of being able to recite correctly. But what is necessary is that your recitation complies with those rules, and only a teacher who knows those rules and is able to apply those rules can actually assist you. So how exactly do you go about this? Now, depending on where you are and where you are from, and your accessibility to scholars and huffaz of the Quran, the simple approach that I recommend is you go to your local masjid or your local Islamic organization and you find out if there are huffaz of the Quran. They don't need to be more senior, they don't need to be your own age, etc. They just need to be qualified, reliable huffaz of the Quran who have studied. And then you ask one of them to assist you with your recitation if they can make some time for you, perhaps offer to pay for their time, for their services, and ask them to listen to your recitation of the Fatiha. Even if we just do this for the Fatiha as a start, it would be a great contribution to the development and the progress of our prayer and of our deen, inshallah ta'ala. So, وَمُرَاعَاتُ حُرُوفِهَا, to observe its correct pronunciation of the letters of the makharij. Next, وَمُرَاعَاتُ تَشْدِيدَاتِهَا, the correct observation of the tashdeeds. Tashdeed, in other words, the shaddas. The shadda is the little symbol that looks like a W. I actually see one on the screen. Let me highlight this for you. So the shadda is the W. Here we go. The little symbol that looks like a W there, that is called a shadda. And what it does is that it indicates that here is two letters. So for example, in the word kulli, it's kul and li. But the two lams are connected, they are joined together and represented by the shadda, as opposed to being written separately. So it's not kulli, right? It's kulli. So that's the shadda. And in the Fatiha, of course, being a necessary component of the prayer, the correct observation of those letters must be observed. So there are 14 in total, and we will go through them bi'idhnillahi ta'ala in this lesson. We proceed وألا يسكت سكتة طويلة ولا قصيرة يقصد بها قطع القراءة. That there should not be يسكت silence. There should not be a moment of silence. طويلة, whether a long silence, ولا قصيرة, or a short silent pause. يقصد بها, that is deliberately done and intended to be قطع القراءة, a cut of the recitation, a pause or a stopping of the recitation. So you should not pause basically, whether short or for long, with the intention of terminating the recitation. If you happen to pause for a different reason, let's say for example you pause to cough, or you pause to sneeze, or you pause to say Ameen, or you pause for whatever reason, you pause your recitation of the Fatiha, it should be fine as long as you do not intend thereby to deliberately stop your recitation. There needs to be some valid reason for it, and Allah knows best. Then وَقِرَاءَةُ كُلِّ آيَاتِهَا وَمِنْهَا الْبَسْمَلَةُ. The recitation of each verse, the recitation of each ayah, وَمِنْهَا, and from its ayat, from the 7 ayat of the Fatiha, the Shafi'i school specifically includes al-basmalatu, the Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, at the start of the Fatiha, and therefore it is necessary to recite the basmala. If you are a Shafi'i school follower, then it is necessary to recite the basmala, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, aloud in the louder prayers and softer in the silent prayers. Now, again, for a beginner, these are some of the more obvious differences between the madhahib, because it is something that is so pivotal in deen. It's something that's so central in deen. You are going to notice that, hold on a minute, this imam is not reciting the Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and this imam is reciting it. So what's the deal here? There are lots of theoretical discussions at a higher level that we could get into, but for now, let's just understand that there's differences of opinion with regards to the recitation of the Fatiha in terms of the basmala, the Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, and whether to recite it aloud or not, and whether it is part of the Fatiha itself or not, and so on. So the conclusion in this discussion is that if you're learning Shafi'i fiqh and if you follow the Shafi'i school of law, then you have to recite it. It is part of the Fatiha, and Allah knows best. As for if you're standing behind an imam who does not recite it, that's perfectly fine as well. For you are going to be assessed, if I can call it that, by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala based on your own recitation. So as long as you recite it, that's fine. But it's also important to note that when there are differences, while we do not allow those differences to cause any friction, between us as Muslims, these differences should be understood. They should be studied in order for us to have an appreciation of those differences, and also in order to not imagine that what we are doing is incorrect because those around us are doing something contrary to that. Right? These are all valid opinions. And as long as we are taking our knowledge from reliable, authentic sources, inshallah ta'ala, we should be fine. So, as a concluding statement, we should be reciting the basmala in the recitation of the Fatiha, and Allah knows best. Then, number 7, وَعَدَمُ اللَّحْنِ الْمُخِلِّ بِالْمَعْنَى. Not to commit a mistake that alters the meaning. So, you can look at footnote number 33. The author states, if one omits one of the Al-Fatiha's letters, fails to double a letter that should be doubled, or substitutes a wrong letter for the right one, it invalidates one's recital of that particular word, and one must recite that word again. This will not invalidate one's salah unless it changes the meaning and was done deliberately. Mistakes in a haraka, a short vowel, are not harmful as long as they do not alter the meaning. So in the science of tajweed, right, we learn that there are basically two types of mistakes in a general sense. There's lahan khafi and there's lahan jali. So the one is an obvious mistake, and this type of mistake would be incorrect, it would be invalid, that would change the meaning. And the other, the khafi type, is a light mistake. It is a mistake, it should be rectified, but it would not affect the validity of one's recitation and therefore the validity of one's prayer, and Allah knows best. Then we move on to the next point, which is point number 8. وأن تكون حالة القيام في الفرض. Just like with the Takbiratul Ihram, the Fatiha must be وأن تكون, and that it be حالة القيام, while standing في الفرض, in the obligatory prayer. وأن يسمع نفسه القراءة. Number 9, to hear one's own recitation. وأن يسمع, to make hear, نفسه, himself, القراءة, the recitation. And exactly what we've explained in the Takbiratul Ihram would apply here as well in the same way. So the volume of your recitation and under normal circumstances and the like. So if you need some revision, just go back to that point there and apply the same rules here. And Allah knows best. Then finally, وَأَلَّا يَتَخَلَّلَهَا ذِكْرٌ أَجْنَبِيٌّ, that they should not be inserted in between the verses or the recitation, dhikrun, any utterance, ajnabiyun, of a foreign language. So just as an example, somebody may be so immersed in their prayer and they're reciting the Fatiha and they get to a verse, let's say, Maliki Yawmiddin, and out of fear or out of humility, for example, the person thinks to say, "Oh Allah, you are the owner of the day of judgment. Please keep me safe on that day." And it's a significantly humble and sincere, statement. But it should not be said, at least not out loud, during the prayer and during the recitation of the Fatiha in an obligatory prayer. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. So those are the 10 conditions of Surah Al-Fatiha. Do take note of them, learn them, study them. And if you can, even memorize them, inshallah ta'ala, so you can at least check the validity of your prayer. Now we move on to the next segment, which is فصل في تشديدات الفاتحة. Remember we said that it is necessary to observe all of the shaddas, all of the that little wow symbol in the Fatiha. We explained that shows a doubling up of the letter. So with that, we will go through each and every one of them. And as I said, there are 14 such shaddas in the Fatiha. So we should observe all of them. So let's have a look at them بإذن الله تعالى. تشديدات الفاتحة 14. The shaddas of the Fatiha are 14. Bismillah, right? I'll try to mark this in a neat enough way بإذن الله تعالى. So the first is Bismillah on Lafdul Jalala, فوق اللام, on top of the lam. Then Bismillahir Rahman, so on top of the Ra of Ar-Rahman, فوق الرا. Then Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim, on top of the Ra again, for Rahim, فوق الرا. Then Alhamdulillah, on top of the lam of Lafdul Jalala, فوق لام الجلالة. Then Rabbil Alameen, on top of the Ba, on Rabb, فوق الباء. Then Rabbil Alameen Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, same as before, on top of the Ra of Ar-Rahman, فوق الرا, on top of the Ra. And then Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, same as before, on top of the Ra for Ar-Rahim, فوق الرا. Then the next, Maliki Yawmiddin, on top of the Dal, in the word Ad-Din, فوق الدال. Then Iyaka, on top of the Ya, for Iyaka na'budu, فوق اليا. Then on top of the Ya again, Iyaka nasta'in, فوق اليا. Then Ihdina الصراط المستقيم, on top of the Sad, in the word as-sirat, فوق الصاد. Then صراط الذين, on top of the lam, in صراط الذين, فوق اللام. And then أنعمت عليهم غير مغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين أنعمت عليهم غير المغضوب عليهم ولا الضالين ولا الضالين on top of the dad as well as on top of the lam. And of all the shaddas in the Fatiha, the one, or rather the set that is easiest to make a mistake in is the last year of the word وَلَضَّالِّينَ, and specifically the pronunciation of this word, because it is a dad. The dad is the most difficult letter to pronounce, and then on top of it, it's followed by a mad وَلَضَّالِّينَ, and then you have to go straight into the lam after that. So it's slightly more complex than the others. So again, practice and then ask a Hafidhul Quran to listen to you and ask them to rectify your mistakes. I know it can be somewhat intimidating, especially for a beginner, to sit in front of somebody and to fix the mistakes that they're making. It's really putting yourself out there, especially for somebody coming from a more Western pedagogy, a more Western background. They may not be accustomed to this type of fixing of one's mistakes, but this is part of our tradition, and Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows best. And then we move on to the next segment, في رفع اليدين عند التكبير. Now, in the more advanced classes, when it comes to the discussion of raising the hands in the salah, there are lots of inter-madhahib differences and discussions as to what exactly is the right way, or whether it should be raised at the various positions. That is not the point of our lesson here. We're not going to get into those discussions, but rather we are just here to learn that it is sunnah to raise the hands in 4 places. So for the Shafi'i school of thought, it is sunnah to raise the hands in 4 places. From the footnote number 35, we can learn something there. It says, it is from the sunan hay'ah of the salah, the wisdom being to show respect and reverence to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That's one observable wisdom, and Allah knows best. So, faslun fi raf'il yadayni 'inda takbiri, the chapter regarding raising the hands at the time of saying Allahu Akbar. Yusannu raf'ul yadayn, it is considered in the Shafi'i school sunnah to raise the hands fi arba'ati mawadi'a, in four places. عند تكبيرة الإحرام, at the time of the opening Allahu Akbar. وعند الركوع, at the time of going into ruku'. وعند الاعتدال, when straightening up from ruku'. وعند القيام من التشهد الأول, and when standing up from the first tashahhud. So to demonstrate this, now of course, again for the Hanafi school as an example, it's only sunnah at the opening Allahu Akbar and not thereafter. So there are some differences. You may see some people not raising their hands, and you may even see some people asking you to not raise your hands, especially if you are not in a predominantly Shafi'i community. But don't let that dissuade you. Learn what is sunnah and use wisdom in learning these matters. And this is how it goes. So the first one, عند تكبيرة الإحرام, to raise the hands. Now we'll explain later the exact method of raising the hands, but basically, and we have explained it before as well, that the palms face the direction of the Qibla, the hands come up to the shoulder, the top of the fingers reaches approximately the top of the ears, the thumb reaches the bottom of the ears, and you say Allahu Akbar. So when you start saying for Allahu Akbar, you raise your hands and you reach the top, and then by the time you finish bar, your hand should be placed in position. Similarly, with the rest of the raising of the hands, it combines or coincides with your movement from one position to the next, and we've explained this as well. So وعند الركوع, you say Allahu Akbar to go into ruku', to bow down. وعند الاعتدال, then when coming up from ruku', سمع الله لمن حمده, right? And then عند القيام من التشهد الأول. Of all of the takbirs, because all of them are easily observable, This one, I see many students getting mixed up in this one. So in any prayer that has more than 2 raka'at, so all of the fard prayers except for Fajr, there are 2 sittings. There's the first sitting, the tashahhud al-awwal, the first sitting in which you say at-tahiyyatu al-mubarakatu as-salawatu at-tayyibatu lillah. So this is the first sitting, which is a sunnah mu'akkada, or one of the what we refer to as a ba'd in the Shafi'i school. The second sitting, the sitting in which you would terminate your salah or end your salah or say assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, that sitting is an integral. So after the first sitting, you come up to stand and you start a new unit of prayer. You start a new raka'ah. When you come up from your first sitting, it is sunnah to say Allahu Akbar by raising the hands as well. So you don't raise the hands when coming up from the first raka'ah of a prayer. You raise your hands when coming up from the second raka'ah because you had the first sitting. You wouldn't raise your hands after the third raka'ah because if it's a 4 raka'ah prayer, say like dhuhr, then you wouldn't raise the hands after coming up from the third raka'ah. So it's only after the first sitting, and Allah knows best. طيب, so let's just look at the note again. A person begins raising his hand with the raising of the head, and the takbir, when he straightens, he lowers his hands. Tamam. So those notes are helpful as well. So those are the 4 places in which the takbir, or rather the raising of the hands, is regarded as sunnah, and Allah knows best. We proceed fi shuruti sujudi, regarding the conditions of prostration. Shurutu sujudi sab'atun. The conditions of prostration are 7. This is also important because the sajda is an integral of the prayer. The conditions of prostration are 7. The first, أن يسجد على 7 أعضاء. It is imperative that one prostrates upon 7 limbs. Okay? Footnote number 39 shows it is sunnah to place the nose on the ground. However, sajda will be in order if the nose does not touch the ground, according to the Shafi'i school. So there's 7 limbs on the ground. Right? Let's look at the 7 limbs. They are the forehead, the palms of the hands, both knees, and the portion under the toes of each foot. Right? The portion under the toes of each foot is the one that some people, or many people, they make a mistake in, because you have to bend your toes a bit in order to accomplish this, right? And some people find that either uncomfortable or they don't know about it, but ensure that your toes are bent so that the front of your toes are pointed towards the qibla. In other words, if you imagine my hands to be my toes, so you basically have to bend your toes like that in order to make sure that the fronts of your toes are pointing towards the qibla, and then you know that the underneath parts of your toes were in fact on the ground. So those are the 7 limbs. So the first one was أَيَسْجُدَ عَلَى 7 أَعْضَاءٍ, to prostrate on 7 limbs. The second, وَأَن تَكُونَ جَبْهَتُهُ مَكْشُوفَةً, that the forehead be exposed. So number 40, or footnote number 40, if one is wearing a bandage over the forehead because of an injury, sajda may be made on the bandage without the need of repeating it afterwards, with the condition that the bandage was put on while one was in the state of purity. However, if you are wearing like a usual, hat or fez or whatever you call this head cover, if you are wearing this, I cannot make sajda on my covered forehead like this. I need to make sure that my head is exposed, or at least that the part of my head that is exposed is in fact on the ground and not a part of the head that is covered. Wallahu subhanahu wa ta'ala a'lam. وَالتَّحَامُلُ بِرَأْسِهِ, and that the weight of the head be carried on the ground, right? To make sajda by resting on the head. In other words, in footnote number 41, you can also see the weight of the head and neck should be applied to the place of sajda so that the forehead is firmly stationed on the ground. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to press your head onto the ground like with force, but it means that you are basically in a relaxed position. So you're not suspending your head. For example, if you look at my hand, this is my wrist here is limp at the moment. If I tense up like that, then it becomes it becomes tensed, right? So I could be touching the ground like that, but the ground is not holding the weight of my hand. But if I let go, so now you can see that as soon as I let go, my hand drops, which means that the ground is actually supporting the weight of my head. So similarly, if you are making sajda, hypothetically speaking, if you are making sajda on some clay, for example, then the imprint of your forehead would be on the clay. You are not holding your head, touching the ground, but you kind of just suspending it there, unless you have some medical reason that that necessitates that. But other than that, the weight of your head needs to be supported by the ground. And then the next point, وَعَدَمُ الْهُوِيِّ لِغَيْرِهِ, not to intend anything but sajda. Look at footnote number 42. If one merely fell down after the i'tidal, this will not be regarded as sajda. The person will have to return to i'tidal and then go into sajda. I remember as a young boy, it was the month of Ramadan, and it was Salatul Taraweeh. So we were praying in this masjid, and there was some insect. I can't recall exactly what insect it was, but it was a flying insect, and it was quite big. And this insect would fly with a force into people's heads. Subhanallah. So I recall specifically hoping that we would go into ruku, or that we would go into sujood, because I was worried that the insect would come my way. So as an example, if you say Sami Allahu liman hamida, Rabbana lakal hamd. Now the next position is the sajda, but the going down into sajda must be purely because you are making sajda, not because there's an insect coming your way and you want to dodge the insect, so you quickly go down so as to miss the insect, and then you think, okay, I'm here, I need to be here anyways. So that's basically the idea of adamul huwiyyi li ghayrihi, not going down for any other reason, because as ikhlas would necessitate, you must only do this for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And it's a nice practical demonstration of the importance of ikhlas, even in our abstract forms of worship, that if a physical form of worship, can be considered like that, an abstract form of worship can be thought of in a similar manner, and Allah knows best. وَأَلَّا يَسْجُدَ عَلَى شَيْءٍ يَتَحَرَّكُ بِحَرَكَتِهِ. This is also one of those points that many people make mistakes with, or they are not familiar with. So to not prostrate on anything that would move with one's movement. A good example of this is somebody was praying next to me once, and they had a shawl over their shoulders. So this shawl obviously is attached to them. When they move, it moves. So what the person did was, every time they would go into sajda, they would take their shawl, place it in front of them, and then make sajda on that shawl. And I think the idea behind that was the dust in the mat would cause the sinuses to act up. A simple solution for this would be to take the shawl off one's shoulders and place it on the ground, or place something else on the ground if you so wish. But you cannot prostrate on something that is connected onto your person. So for example, your cuff, if you have a very wide cuff or sleeve, and then you prostrate on that, that would be considered invalid, and Allah knows best. طيب, number 6. وارتفاع أسفاله على أعياله, or rather على عاليه, that the lower portion of one's body, in other words one's bottom, one's behind, is raised على أعاليه, above the higher portion of one's body, meaning the head. So to simply put it, that one's rear be higher than one's head. And obviously, if you're going to sajda, this is natural, because here you are standing, the tops of my fingers is your head. So then you go into sajda, naturally your bottom would be higher than your top, and that's basically just to preserve the form of the sajda. And then, very importantly as well, وَالطُّمَأْنِينَةُ فِيهِ. Number 7, to remain motionless for a moment while prostrating. Now notice there's no mention of Subhan Rabbi al-A'la, but what is mentioned is to remain motionless for a moment while prostrating. Why is this? Because the recitation of Subhan Rabbi al-A'la is a sunnah. But what is required to make your sajda valid is that you just remain in a moment of pause, in a moment of being motionless. That there is referred to as tuma'nina. And generally, the books of fiqh would advise that this be at least for the length of time required to say Subhanallah. That is enough. What you can also learn from this is that to simply touch the ground and come up, where there was no moment of pause, you basically just went down and came up, that would not be valid as a sajda, and Allah knows best. So you don't need to recite anything in the sajda. It is recommended, but you have to remain motionless. So those are the 7 conditions of the sajda, of prostration. Learn them, know them, understand them, memorize them, teach them to others, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. And with that we conclude. In this lesson we covered the 16 conditions of the opening takbir. We covered the 10 conditions of Surah Al-Fatiha, the 14 shaddas of Surah Al-Fatiha, and the 4 places to raise the hands, as well as the 7 conditions of prostration. Until next time, inshallah, jazakumullahu khairan, wa sallallahu ala sayyidina Muhammad, subhanallahi wa bihamdi, subhanakallahumma wa bihamdik, nashhadu an la ilaha illa anta, nastaghfiruka wa